I see. Ian, it's 7 o'clock now, and
Right.
I see that already attendees are joining our session. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And I'll just say hi to you again. Hello, Ian.
Good evening. How are you doing, Yun Jong?
Good, thank you. As we said earlier, we've had a really lovely day today and where I live. So yeah, just took a walk and stuff. What about you?
Yeah, really nice here. It's packed up lovely, very warm day. It's very feels very different from what it's been like the last few weeks.
I know, absolutely. So we have participants joining, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Just to let you know, all of your screens are turned off and you are all muted. So please don't worry about being recorded or anything like that, and just relax and tune into Ian's how to create psychological safety meeting session tonight. If you have any questions at all whilst Ian's going through his presentation, please just pop it in the chat, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the session today. So Ian, before you start your talk for today, I just wanted to mention how I sort of got to know you at John Lewis Partnership.
Yep.
So just for the audience, I obviously attended one of the council meetings at the Audney Hotel owned by John Lewis Partnership. These council meetings are for councillors, because John Lewis is an employee ownership organisation and it's very democratic, and their decision-making process is, and Ian is the expert for that anyway. So I came along to this meeting to just hear what councillors have to say, representing their own branch views and regional views, and challenging the boards of directors. And Ian Hiscock, our special presenter for today, was facilitating the whole session, and that was massive. And Ian has done that for, I don't know, Ian, how many years?
I was president of the John Lewis Council for 7 years, and acting president of the Partnership Council for about 1.5 years. So yeah, so I must have facilitated somewhere in the region of about 35 or 40 of that type of meeting.
And they are basically massive meetings, a few hundreds joining in physically, and thousands of John Lewis partners tuning in real time live, and then could watch back as well. And Ian facilitates all the sessions, and they could at times obviously be quite heated, because the nature of meetings are challenging, whoever was accountable for whatever line of work they were responsible for. And Ian was brilliant, I have to say. Ian was fantastic, and I've never come across such a facilitator like Ian. And I came home, and then I started tuning in the upcoming session, and then I dug out some previous sessions that Ian facilitated, just only because to learn Ian's facilitation techniques, and also to learn about business, obviously. So and then obviously when I had some meetings that I found quite challenging at John Lewis, it's actually really putting it mildly, I found really daunting. Some meetings that I had to run as product manager, I went to Ian. So I was, Ian, you don't know me, but I know you. I know you. I'm your fan. Basically, I need to learn some facilitation techniques from you urgently, because I'm struggling. And Ian, without knowing who I was, Ian was brilliant, Unjung. Let's have a series of workshops to help you with help you learn some facilitation techniques. That's how we got to know each other. Ian, would that be correct to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it's one of the things when you work in an organisation as big as John Lewis, and you do that sort of role where you're facilitating meetings, as Yun Jong was saying. It seems like everybody knows you, but you don't know everybody. But yeah, so Yun Jong got in contact with me, and I think we sort of sat down about 3 times, didn't we? And just talked about some of the challenges that you were sort of facing into. And then, of course, we've got back in touch again more recently, which is how this has come about.
So Ian, thank you very much again for accepting my invitation to speak at the summit. You are not alone. I really, really appreciate your support. Thank you everyone for joining tonight. Yeah, so please just pop it in the chat if you have any questions about how to create a psychological safety in meetings, and whilst Ian goes through his presentation tonight. On that note, I'll pass it over to Ian now. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Ian John. Right, good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining. Let me take you through a little bit about what I'm going to cover tonight. I'll start off talking just about my background very briefly, and why psychological safety I think is important, what it is, why it matters, a little bit about the consequences of its absence, and particularly the importance of that given the experience that many of us will have had over the last 12 months, having to conduct so much more of our work like this on a Zoom call. I'll talk a little bit about how you build it, a little bit how you deal with conflict as well. Ian John was really keen that I talk about how you might deal with difficult situations in meetings that sort of crop up in the moment. Then I've got a couple of case studies. Hopefully I have time to go through all of those with you. And then, as Ian John said, we'll open it up, a little bit of a discussion. Any questions that you've got, as she said, please put those in the chat as we go along, and I'll attempt to answer those for you when we get to that stage. So without further ado, a little bit of background about myself. As Ian John has touched on, we both work for the John Lewis Partnership, which is the largest employee-owned business in the United Kingdom. I spent the vast majority of my career there, 29 years, variety of roles in sort of commercial setting, working with directors, acting as a sort of critical friend to directors. In addition to that, as Ian John said, and that was the day job, what I did as president of the John Lewis Council and the Partnership Council was sort of in addition to that. And I chaired those meetings, chaired meetings of a group of elected representatives who came together with leaders, the most senior leaders in the business, including the chief executive and their board of directors, and facilitated meetings about issues which were of concern to employees within the John Lewis Partnership. And I did that over a period of about seven and a half years in total. I'm also an accredited member of the Association of Facilitators. So all of the experience I sort of picked up in the partnership was pretty much learning on the job, by the seat of my pants. I developed my own style. I got some really helpful feedback, obviously, from people that I work with, but I sort of assimilated that and very much did things in my own way. Having left the partnership about 18 months ago now, one of the things that I looked to do was to try to formalise some of my learning around facilitation. And so I undertook a couple of courses last year run by the Association of Facilitators, and you can find them on LinkedIn if you'd like to find out a little bit more about them. Just to sort of put a bit of a framework, a bit of formality around my knowledge, I suppose. So I had a bit more of a toolbox to dip into. And then, as I put on the slide, I've sort of facilitated a wide range of events, board level strategy meetings. I've chaired redundancy processes, both inside John Lewis and for other organisations as well. Typical workshops, as well as the elected employee meetings that we've been talking about. And why have I done all that? I suppose because I've come to realise that I think there's real value in people coming together to work, collaborate, to be constructive, where everyone is valued and feels able to sort of contribute with honesty. And what I suppose I didn't realise at the time was I was starting to model something that I've since come to realise is called psychological safety. And so why am I here? Why are we talking about this tonight? I think it is really important that I say I'm not a mental health or well-being expert, and I know that some of you will have tuned into some really terrific talks over the past week from people that, when I look at their backgrounds, I was a little bit freaked out by, because I thought, crikey, all these people are professional speakers and really, really expert in their field. And I'm not. I'm not trained in mental health or wellbeing. I'm not a behavioural psychologist. But Ian John and I got talking, and she was kind enough to sort of point out the experience that she thinks that I've got in terms of facilitation. And we talked about the recognition, I suppose, of the stress and the anxiety that can come about when people don't feel that their contribution is valued, or they're not heard or respected. And when you think about the amount of our lives that we spend at work, it just seemed that the subject of how you can work together more effectively, how you can make meetings harmonious, effective, was something that fitted actually quite well with the subject of the summit and the subject of the conversations that have been taking place over the last week. So that's why I'm here. I hope that makes sense. So let me start off by explaining a little bit about what psychological safety is. There's a couple of videos or articles that I point you to that are really worth a read, because they've really helped my thinking on this subject. The first one is by Amy Edmondson, who works out of Harvard, or at least used to, and she did a great TED talk on psychological safety back in 2014, and of course that's still available on YouTube. But Amy Edmondson said that psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or penalised for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or acknowledging your mistakes. And then when I was sort of exploring the subject in a bit more detail last year after I left John Lewis, I came across a series of really great articles by a guy called Matthew Syed in the Sunday Times. Some of you may know that he used to be a professional table tennis player. I think he was world ranked top 10 and he went to the Olympics. But he's since transformed himself into, first of all, a sports journalist, and he now writes commentary pieces in the Sunday Times. Incredibly thoughtful, incredibly erudite guy. And he simply summed it up as a place where people aren't fearful to offer opinions divergent from their leader. So if you can seek out either of those pieces, I'd really encourage you to do so, because they both had a sort of a formative effect on what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. Two things I will say. You'll notice that I refer to the importance of the role of leaders a lot in this, and you'll pick that out equally if you read what Matthew's written and what Amy's written as well. Leaders are critical. They have to model this within an organisation for it to carry weight. And the organisation then has to sort of take that approach and take it all the way through the organisation. For psychological safety to be effective, it has to be applied consistently. Otherwise, it feels inauthentic, and of course, its impact is diluted if it's not felt all the way through an organisation. A little bit more about what it is, and this comes from a writer called Timothy Clark, who's written extensively on psychological safety, but he says it boils down to 4 key components effectively. First is inclusion safety, and that's that basic human need to connect, to belong, and to be accepted for who they are and what they bring. The second element is learner safety, feeling comfortable to learn, to grow, to ask questions, to receive feedback, and to do that knowing that that feedback and your contribution is going to be accepted as valid and it's going to be valued. The third element is contributor safety, so that you feel you can participate openly and that you can use your skills to their fullest extent. And lastly, challenger safety. There is a need with all of us to make things better, to ask questions, maybe for for some of us more than others, to challenge the status quo, but to do so without risk of damage to your reputation. And I hope that we can all relate to these 4 areas. They feel basic, but they're so often absent from meetings and the workplace more broadly. I'm sure all of you can relate to meetings that you'll have been to where there's just this crushing need to get things done and to skate through a process without really taking the time to reflect, to include people, to make sure that people have had the opportunity to contribute and say what they really feel about any given situation. So with all of this, when you look at it on a slide like this, may feel pretty straightforward. It's amazing how often its absence can be felt. So why does it matter? It matters because, as we've just talked about, it meets a number of basic human needs to feel included and accepted for who you are and what you bring to any given situation. It allows participants to be at their best, to be authentic, and to be themselves. And if these benefits are obvious, as Matthew Syed points out in his articles, if you read them, it is now recognised as one of the cornerstones of high-performing teams. And it also allows you a chance to flatten hierarchies. So as I said, one of the key things that I'll talk about as we go through this for the next 15 minutes is the role of leaders, how leaders can be great role models, but great role models quite often being from being quiet, from being reflective, and through allowing others to have space. And so, never is that more important in the meeting than a leader allowing challenge to take place, to welcome it, even expecting it. And again, I challenge you to think of the occasions where you've been to meetings and that hasn't been the case. Equally, and again, refer back to Amy Edmondson in this case, it means mistakes are accepted. And one of Amy's contentions is that the best teams are not teams that don't make mistakes, but actually teams that do make mistakes and actually make them on a frequent basis. But that because the environment is one where mistakes are recognised openly and accepted, and that you learn from them in an open way and then you move on from them, there's much more learning done in teams that make mistakes than in those that try to eliminate error. And lastly, and as I've just touched on, and I'll come back to again through the course of the presentation, psychological safety can help to reduce power differentials, and that can really be effective in building confidence in genuine collaboration. So if those are the sort of the upsides, what's the downside through not having psychological safety where you work? Well, ultimately, and fairly obviously, it will have a negative impact on morale, on productivity, and ultimately talent retention. Meetings will move into an area where blame and criticism reliably escalate into conflict. That promotes defensiveness, and that's an enemy to good outcomes. And again, I can think of the number of occasions where me personally, I've been on the defensive, and I haven't said what's been on my mind, and I haven't put out there what I wanted to say, and feel frustrated afterwards. And if it's not just me, if it's more than me, then obviously the meeting hasn't been as effective as it should have been. But bringing this right up to date, my contention is also that in a world where we are operating predominantly online, as many of us have been for the last 12 months, not only does a lack of psychological safety risk productivity, critical in itself, obviously, to an organisation's effectiveness, but it also risks heightening a sense of alienation and isolation. There's been a lot of talk over the last 12 months about whether there is a new normal, which is a phrase I hate, but I won't get into that now. But I think whatever you feel about that, there's probably an expectation that for many of us, we will do more of our work online in the future than we were doing 12 months ago. And if that's the case, then people who run teams and leaders of organisations need to have a heightened awareness of mental well-being and the impact that working on your own in a room like this is going to have. Over the last year, we've probably all done it with family and friends around us because of lockdowns, wherever we've lived. As the world does return to normal, so I think it will become increasingly the case that people working at home will be on their own for 6 to 9 hours of the day. Kids will be at school or at college. One member of the household will be out working. The other may be stuck at home. I think it's unlikely that, what we've experienced the last 12 months will carry on. And so you're stuck at home for, say, 6 to 9 hours by yourself without seeing anybody. And if you don't feel included, if you don't feel valued, if you feel alienated from your workplace, not only physically, but because there is no value placed on your contribution, then I think the potential for that to have an impact on people's mental well-being is fairly clear and obvious. And of course, as I've put at the bottom of the slide there, the ability to pick up on that is so much harder. I can see you and John and I now in the little box on the side of the screen, and we've been sat in Zoom meetings where there may be 20 or 30 participants. The ability to check body language in the way that you can do when you're in a physical meeting is so much harder when it's just head and shoulders. And so, A, you have to be, I think, more conscious about checking in with people and asking, but B, it makes the environment in which you meet and work all the more important. Last thing I'll say before moving on to this slide, because I realise I've expanded on that and I've gone off on one a little bit there, but this is where I think the importance of the subject comes in. Glassdoor did a survey last year which shows that workplace culture and the quality of leadership are far and away the most important ingredients for potential employees and existing employees in deciding whether they join or stay in an organisation. Pay and benefits only comes sixth on the list. So you can see there that if you don't have a workplace environment that people feel they want to be a part of, they will look elsewhere. So how do you go about building this subject? How do you go about building psychological safety? And again, I'm going to start from the leadership perspective and say, if you're a leader, psychological safety requires humility, and it requires a recognition of your own fallibility. And that's tough. People look to leaders for certainty a lot of the time. But it's my contention that really effective leaders are not unprepared to show some fallibility and to show some humility, in the sense that they recognise that other people can contribute just as valuably as they can. So model curiosity, genuinely be open, ask lots of questions. And, you know, I've put a couple here that, again, I think these came from Amy Edmondson. I may miss something. I need to hear from you. But the third quote on there is one that was said to me by a senior leader who'd come to these meetings that John was referring to at the start, these meetings in John Lewis. I come to these meetings because I learned things I wasn't aware of. And I think for a leader to have that sense of their own fallibility, that they don't know 100% of stuff, and that they can learn something from listening to others, is really powerful. And ask for solutions rather than offering them. Doing that and asking for feedback from people who, on the face of it, are subordinate to you, is disarming, and it can be really powerful at reducing power differentials. So leadership role is absolutely critical. Moving on, this is now about the mechanics of stuff, I suppose, a little bit more. If the last slide was about the role of leaders, this is about actually getting into meetings. Some of this, again, may be obvious, but again, I'd ask you to reflect on your own experience and ask yourself how many times the things that you see on this slide are not the case. Now, Jung and I used to work in an organisation that had about, at the time, 85,000 employees. And that meant there were an awful lot of people who wanted to attend meetings. And my strong belief was that a lot of those meetings were ineffective because there were too many people there. So it may sound brutal, and in one sense, it may sound counterintuitive to what I'm saying about collaboration and encouraging contribution. But if you want your meetings to be effective, and if you want the people who are there to feel able to contribute, try to only invite those people who are absolutely essential. Eliminate the hangers-on. I would see departments who would bring 3 or 4 people to a meeting. I think that's wrong. If you can't identify one person who can speak on behalf of a function, you have to ask yourself why that's the case. If you're operating in the online world, try, as I say, you know, as that previous point that makes, try to keep the meetings as small as you possibly can. Studies have shown that Zoom, Teams, you know, Microsoft Teams meetings work best if you can aim for about 6 or 7 people, or maximum plus or minus 2 on either side of that. What that also does, as the slide says, it places a subtle responsibility on people to contribute. Again, and I'm terrible for this, if there's a silence in the room, I will probably be the person who has to break it, because I cannot stand silences. I'm not always sure that my contribution is the most erudite, but I feel that I have to get the ball rolling on occasions. So it does help if you can keep this meeting small. It does, you know, encourage people to contribute. Where you've got larger groups, you know, I've seen it work brilliantly in meetings that I've been a part of. Use breakout rooms in the virtual world, and if you can, get someone to facilitate those as well, somebody who's independent of the subject matter that's being discussed. It's not a deal breaker, but if you can do it, it's really effective. And if we're talking about the physical world, just if you're in a large room, get people to go into one corner, to go into a breakout space. If you're in a large office building, if it's a lovely day like today, go outside. I've had some really effective meetings out in the open air. It encourages people. I think it sort of inspires people that little bit more. And then the last thing, and this is critical, you know, even an organization as big and as omnipresent, omnipowerful as Amazon do this. Rethink big presentations. Again, countless meetings that we've all been to where somebody talks a bit like I am now for about half an hour with a big presentation. If it's possible to send that out in advance for people to read through, and you just give a really brief summary when you get to the meeting, do so. Try to make meetings as participatory as you can, rather to have big chunks of the meeting with people in receiving mode. It dulls people's senses, it turns them off. So try and get people engaged in the meeting as quickly as you can after it starts. It's hugely important, I find. Carrying on, shorten meetings as much as you can. Again, I reckon we've all been in meetings where, you know, the meeting expands to fill the time. I'd ask you to consider how many meetings really need to be an hour long. Maybe even half an hour when you can. There's some great techniques you can get for speeding up the process. Many of you may have come across meetings where you stand up in the room and nobody sits down. That tends to focus minds a lot. But you only probably want to do that for a meeting that lasts for half an hour at most. One of the things that's really struck me again in the online world is people moving from meeting to meeting, or Zoom call to Zoom call like this, with no break in between. And then at the end of the day, going from their office space, wherever it is in their house, into the lounge and having absolutely no time to sort of like power down the brain. If it's possible within your organization, and given what I've just said, can you make meetings 50 minutes rather than an hour, or 25 minutes rather than a half an hour, and try to make that a function of your organization, so that meetings run from 10 o'clock to 10:50, and then people have got a 10-minute break from 10:50 to 11 o'clock, or 10 o'clock to 10:25, and then a 5-minute break before you start the next meeting. If you can make that an expectation within your organization, it just gives people the chance to breathe and then to sort of think about what's coming next. My contention would be, if you're moving from meeting to meeting without a break, again, the effectiveness and the willingness of people to want to contribute is going to decline the longer you go on through the day. A great idea, and again, I think this was an Amy Edmondson one, but it may have come up in some of the other reading that I've come across in psychological safety. A lot of your meetings will be very outcome driven, obviously, and will have some quite high stakes attached to them. If you can try to break up the meeting week with what are called no agenda meetings, primarily for two separate reasons. One, just to give people the chance to check in what's happening, to talk about what's happening at work as well as what's not happening at work. It replaces a little bit of the small talk that we've lost over the last year, the stuff that happened at the start of meetings, or when you were in your open plan office and just chatting to your mates over the desk. But if you can just try to make time for that. My wife has just started a new job this week, and at the moment, the company that she's working with are setting aside just half an hour a week just for the team to chat over a coffee and to talk about some of the stuff that's going on at work, but what they did over the weekend as well, because they recognize there's no other time to do it probably. So that's time that's set aside and has no agenda attached to it and no outcome attached to it. A little bit more work focused is something called magic time, where you just get people together to talk very broadly about what they're working on, but with no specific agenda. Just get someone to come in. At John Lewis, the online teams used to do something called brown bag meetings, where there'd be a topic which either one of them gave, or somebody came in from outside would give a talk, and then they would just riff ideas off of each other and try to build ideas. Somebody would start the conversation on, and I think the idea was you built and built and built on it. So you took the idea as something that was worth running with rather than disregarding. But then people tried to build it from just adding something onto it until you got to something that you thought you could run with. But the essential idea is that you have a meeting with very loose agenda, where people just collaborate and share ideas without there being something specific that you came in at the start of the meeting with. Both of these just encourage people to find their voice, to build confidence in the validity of their contribution. And if you can do it in those environments, then when they go into meetings which are a bit more high stakes, which do have a much stricter, tighter purpose to them, then hopefully you're encouraging an environment where they feel that they're able to contribute. But of course, you need the same environment in those meetings as you do in the no agenda meetings. I'm just checking, how am I doing for time, John? About another 5 minutes?
No, I think you have about 11 minutes actually.
Okay, okay, right.
Take your time, because I know you have exciting stuff coming through on and stuff.
Okay, so last bit on how you build psychological safety critically. And I've touched on this, but just to summarize, you've got to try to ensure that if you're putting some effort into this as a subject, it's adopted consistently through your organisation, not just in certain meetings, but in all your meetings, and not even just in meetings. You know, we have loads of conversations that take place outside meetings with line managers and people more senior to us. And again, if people feel like psychological safety is modelled in some places but not in others, it will feel inauthentic. And people's perception of the commitment to it as a concept will waver if they experience it in some places and not with others. So if you're thinking about taking this back into your organisation and thinking about, do we do it at the moment? You may well do it in some places, you may well do it really well, but ask yourself if you're doing it all the way through. Now, just something fairly specific before I come on to a few case studies. And this one sometimes gets a few smiles when I talk about it, but it's really important. So this again goes back to the role of leaders and also touches on power differentials, which I talked about earlier. So there's a concept, and I got this from Matthew Syed's articles. There's a concept called the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. And we will all have been in a room where we know who that person is, and we allow them to start off the conversation, to put their opinion across. And what tends to happen is two or three things. We don't say anything once they've spoken because they're the leader, they're the highest paid person. Or we become more deferential, and all we do is fall into line with them and agree with what they've said, which just gives them the view that, you know, they've done a good job, they've encouraged people to contribute, and what they said was right. So they go away safe in the knowledge that they've hit the nail on the head. If they go and visit people, they tend to get what I call the smell of fresh paint wherever they go. People have prepared for their arrival. And they're not natural with them. They go into business units, and what they experience is not a natural state of affairs because they're the highest paid person. So how do you get around those things? Well, and this is where the value of a facilitator can come in. And don't worry, this isn't a plug for me in any way. This is a plug for facilitation generally and its value. Encourage them to speak last, or even not at all. The power of going into a meeting and recognizing that you've got a leader in there, you've got a HIPPO in there, and they stay silent is really marked. So see if they can reflect and remain silent. That can actually be easier to achieve in online meetings, because the virtue of not being physically present can take away a little bit of the intimidation factor. When all you can see is this, rather than the HIPPO sort of bearing down on you in a meeting room, it can be a little bit easier to contribute. But again, there needs to be an awareness of that, and the meeting needs to be facilitated. And as a facilitator, I would seek out the HIPPO before the meeting on occasions and get their agreement to act in the way that I've described here. And a couple of the case studies that I touch on kind of sort of speak to that point. Now, Yunjong wanted me to talk a little bit about conflict, more accurately, how do you prevent it? So what I'm going to talk about a little bit here is setting expectations around behavior and etiquette. And I would contend that probably we've all sat in meetings where 95% of the time that doesn't happen. So I think as a facilitator, it's critical that you set those expectations and that you say to people, you know, how you want the meeting to be conducted. What I'm going to share with you now is going to sound like it's, you know, completely obvious. But again, I would say, you know, 95% of the meetings I've sat through, this has never happened. So stuff like any question is valid. Nothing in this meeting will be considered stupid. People will listen respectfully and not interrupt. Challenge will be constructive, and it will be about the issues raised, not about the person who raises them. We'll attempt not to talk across each other. Not always easy, especially when you're online and you have those silences that seem to go on for ages and then everybody dives in. Again, that's where facilitation can help, but you make an attempt to do that. Maybe invite at the start of the meeting for attendees to say what's most important to them about what's on the agenda. What are their priorities? What do they want to get from the meeting? If you're trying to establish an environment of psychological safety, also say to them, what are they most concerned about what's on the agenda? Maybe because they don't understand the subject or because of the consequences of getting the decision wrong. Inviting them to be open at the start, it can be especially liberating, particularly if they know they're not going to be judged as a result for admitting to that uncertainty. But what happens if a conflict does happen in the meeting? Well, this is why I think, etiquette and setting expectations are critical, because if then conflict does emerge between two or more people, you can draw them back to that agreement that you've made and said, look, we agreed this is the way that we would conduct ourselves, didn't we? That should work, but sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't, you need to deal with the conflict, I think at least, in as neutral a way as you can, trying to draw the comments back to the issues again, rather than back to a person or the perceived instigator. Now that can be difficult, again, we'll have been in meetings where people have been way out of line, but if you're trying to get the meeting back, I think it's really helpful to try to concentrate on the issue rather than the people involved. If somebody has been way out of line, I'd suggest that what you need to do is to try and pick them up outside of the meeting, unless of course it's just so far beyond the pale that you do have to say something, and of course that is the correct thing to do. If it's between two specific participants, just attempt to summarize the essence of the dispute in a non-judgmental way, as I've said, and gain their agreement. So try and summarize what you've heard. Generally, I try to avoid using phrases like what I've heard, because it makes it sound like your opinion. But if you're an independent facilitator and you're in a conflict situation, I think you can get away with it, because then you can go back to the protagonist and go, did I get that right? So I think you can try and take it on, try to silence them, and try and summarize where you've got to. But do check in with the people involved. Don't try and breeze past it. Don't try and dodge the issue. Conflict can be healthy at times. It needs to be done constructively, though. It's when it becomes personal that it becomes the issue. If it's issues based and it's about trying to get to a resolution, then providing you can do so without without people being bruised psychologically by it, then that's fine. Okay, I'm going to rattle through these case studies because I've had about 7 or 8 of the 11 minutes that you and John talked about.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No need to breeze past them. Please do take your time. I think it's
okay. Sorry, I always get really conscious of time.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you, but do take your time, please.
So I've got 3 case studies to go through. The first concerns. So this is one of the meetings that you and John and I were talking about at the start. So, large meeting of elected representatives. Critical event in the John Lewis Partnership's calendar, meeting with senior directors. And we'd had feedback, those of us who were responsible for putting the meeting together had previously had feedback from the elected reps, feeling that they weren't always given a fair shake. They weren't listened to by the senior directors on occasions, or they may be shut down or not given a fair amount of time to express their views. And on occasions, almost that the senior directors rejected the premise of the question, rejected the fact that life may feel tough from the perspective of the elected rep or the people they were representing, because the metrics were saying something different, something like that. So the solution that we came up with was to completely alter the structure of these sessions, which normally took place on a half-yearly basis. And rather than allowing the senior leader to talk for, say, 25 minutes, half an hour, and then go into a question and answer back and forth between the elected reps and the leader, which is when we then tended to get into the situation that I've just described. What we did was we completely altered the situation. The presentation was sent out in advance, as I talked about previously. There was an expectation clearly that all of the elected reps were going to read that and understand it and ask questions of clarification beforehand where they needed to. And then what we did was we gave them an hour just to talk about their experience and what was in the report and their observations and their reflections on it, with absolutely no input from the senior leader or their board. They had to sit there on their hands basically and listen. Then what we did was we had a break and they were able to get their notes up to date, and then we gave them almost like a right of reply, as it were, for about 20-25 minutes, so as they could reflect on publicly what they'd heard. And then we had about another half an hour on top of that, where there was then direct question and answering backwards and forwards. It was still pretty charged on occasions, but the fact was that the people who were elected by the employees of the John Lewis Partnership felt that they had a much fairer shake, a much better opportunity to get the views of the people that they represented across. And that the leaders were able then to reflect much more rather than feel like they had to answer in the moment every single point that was being raised. So I know that not everybody agreed. I know that not all of the leaders were desperately comfortable with the way that we arranged it, but I did feel that it was a move on from what we've experienced. And I think there was some really sort of profound learning that came out from the observations and the reflections that were shared. The second case study actually involved me working with a leader where there'd been a deterioration in the relationship between this person and a group of employees. They felt that the information that they got from this leader and their team was quite often obtuse and dense and very hard to understand. And so they switched off from sort of, you know, the contact that they had, or the sort of the interaction that they had with this individual. Not only did that impact on their confidence in the individual, it impacted on the individual's confidence as well. And they became suspicious of their relationship with this group of employees and frustrated by it, to the point where this person, really confident, super talented, really gregarious and a thoroughly decent individual, really was frustrated with the situation that they found themselves in. So again, solution there was, you know, for me to invest time with this person. I gave him, I think, more unvarnished feedback than he had from the group. He'd been putting together 2 and 2, and he'd pretty much got 4, but it was still sort of coming through third parties. So I tried to give him some pretty sort of straightforward feedback, and asked for his feelings around that. And then we talked about how we might improve the situation and agreed on actions to go forward, but said that I wanted to share his commitment with the group, so that they could have confidence in that before they both stepped into that arena again. And it took time. You know, it wasn't resolved as a consequence of that one meeting I had with him. I checked in with him again after the first time he came together with the group and asked him how that felt, and continued to get their feedback, and gradually the relationship improved. I'd love to have had more time with it, but I moved on and life moved on. But it shows that sometimes as a facilitator, if you're looking to create psychological safety, you can't just do it in the meetings themselves. You have to take time out with your key stakeholders and work out why something isn't happening and invest the time in it to improve the situation. And then the third example was to talk about something involving a hippo. If the person I was talking about knew I was referring to them as this, they'd kill me. But this was about recognizing in advance a situation which was actually fraught with some difficulties. This was talking about a proposition, a business proposition, which had landed badly and had an impact on the business's customers and the business's employees as well. And so the leader was going to get feedback from employees on this. And I recognised there was an absolutely critical need for me to meet with this person in advance to outline the possible issues that would take place in the conversation. Not the issues related to the proposition, this individual was well aware of that, but the emotion that surrounded it. And the fact that that emotion needed to be spoken and let out before we could actually get on to the business issues. And so I spoke with that to this leader and got their agreement that we would have some time where, again, they would sit on their hands, but we would allow the emotion to come out. We would allow people to talk about the impact that this had had on employees before we then moved on to talk about what the actual business issues were and how we'd improve them. Critically, though, as I've got on the slide, we also allowed that individual the chance to respond, engage and reply once the other participants had contributed. But to give them absolute credit, they bought into the strategy and they were brilliant in their own execution of it. And the first 30 minutes of the conversation were incredibly difficult because the emotion that came out was almost visceral. It had been building up for over a year probably, but without that sort of half an hour of letting that emotion out and then dissipate, we wouldn't have been able to get into the critical business discussion which then took place. So here, for me, it was important that I made sure that everybody involved, not just this leader, but the people who were offering the feedback, knew how the discussion was going to be facilitated and structured, knew what their role in it was, and what my expectations as a facilitator were. So there we go. There's something about three elements there of psychological safety, and how as a facilitator you can work to build it. That's it. We've got about a quarter of an hour, so that has gone on for a bit longer than we wanted, but I know you and John, was keen for me to take you all the way through it. I really hope it's useful. It isn't necessarily, directly about the subject of this conference, this summit that you and John have so wonderfully put together. But we both felt that it had a real relevance in the sense that in the absence of psychological safety, you can't be yourself at work. It's difficult to be authentic. That limits your own contribution and it limits the effectiveness of your organisation. So for me, it's a win-win all round. It doesn't have to be difficult, but it requires commitment and it requires consistency of application. And with that, I'll shut up. I need to drink something because my throat's drying up, and look forward to having a chat.
Oh, that was a very subtle cue for me to step in for discussion. Thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for Ian for this wonderfully helpful talk today, how to create psychological safety meetings. And so yeah, please just pop it in the chat if you have any questions at all, and we'll try to answer. Yeah, so some of these discussions that we've had in advance of the session today. So some of my colleagues, what the questions they had were, they usually participate meetings as a participant rather than a facilitator. And some of them had some rather unfortunate meetings that it was a horror show basically, and they were the center of sort of being shut down. Being shut down, and they actually cried outside meetings because they felt so upset and they felt attacked or etc., dismissed, what have you. So from a participant perspective, in such meetings, the facilitators are not doing much to avoid the situations. What the individual and the participant can do?
I think it's a great question, and it's incredibly tough, and I wouldn't want to minimize the difficulty of it. I think sometimes it's possible to minimize the difficulty, because if you are a participant who's been made to feel like that, the last thing that you want someone like me to do is to say that you should speak up and express how that's made you feel in the meeting. If you've been made to feel like that in the meeting, it's probably the last thing that you want to do. So I recognize that that's very hard. If you've been in the meeting which has been facilitated by somebody who should have been playing that role, I do think it's worth you having a conversation with that individual if you feel that you are able to do so, and to talk to them, I think, about the way that you've been made to feel. My strong suspicion that is in 99.5 times out of 100, anybody who's given the role of facilitator, knowing that an individual or more than one person in a meeting has felt that way, would really want to take that on board. Probably feel in a way quite wounded by it as well, potentially, if you're very conscious of yourself. If you're just, I think there's a difference between being a facilitator and just almost administrating a meeting, if that makes sense. But if you really do see yourself as a facilitator, I think you'd want that feedback. If you're in a meeting where there isn't somebody playing that role clearly, I think it is very difficult. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you think about how you feel in the meeting itself, because as I said, I think that can be really hard and can perhaps make those feelings even worse, and it will probably make you feel more worried about the way you're perceived. I think the only thing I can say is I think you should have a conversation with your line manager or your supervisor, whatever the nature of the structure is within your organisation, or the person that you feel most able to trust. Some of you may be fortunate enough to work with a coach in some of your organisations, so that might be a good person to go to. But I think fundamentally, if you don't feel like you can speak in the moment, or you don't have a facilitator to go to, you need to speak to the person that you can trust the most, and to work out a way forward in that. It's not perfect. I'm conscious that that doesn't really present a solution to the problem, but I think the problem is a really difficult one to resolve.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Ian. We have a few questions coming through in the chat. So we have one from Natasha. How can you establish that consistency you mentioned in a culture, in particular, a larger organization?
That's a really good question from Natasha. I'd go back to what I said a couple of times, I think, in the presentation. We talk about a lot of organizations now, we talk about the desirability of having flatter structures, flatter hierarchies, and less differentials between senior and less senior people. But the fact is, in most organizations, there is somebody who is identifiable at the top of the structure. And I think if you're going to have this in your organization, it has to be modeled from the top and it has to permeate down. And people at each level, the individual at the very top of the organization has to set an expectation of the people who immediately report to him or her. And he or she has to say to those people, I expect you to go down to the next level, and I expect them to go down to the next level, and so on and so forth. Or whether it's psychological safety or any other initiative in an organization, we all know that if it matters to the top person in the organization, it tends to then filter down and matter to the people below them. So I think that's one thing. It has to matter to the people at the top. It has to be modeled consistently. And you mustn't assume that if you think you've got it licked and you've got it in your organization, don't stop paying attention to it. Because commercial organizations, not only commercial organizations, I work with charities, and charities are incredibly pressured. They have a pressure to deliver for the people who rely on them, for vulnerable people. All organizations face into pressure to deliver outcomes, at speed. And so if you neglect psychological safety over a period of time, you can easily see it ebbing away, almost as human nature reasserts itself, and that need to drive outcomes at speed creeps back in. I'm not saying that psychological safety slows up processes. I think far from it. But in our desire to reach an outcome and to be able to show an outcome to somebody, it's very easy to narrow down the opportunity to have a conversation, to narrow down the opportunity for people to contribute. So I think leadership commitment, consistency of application, and then not neglecting it once you think you've made some real progress.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ian. That's really helpful. And we have a few more questions coming through. So I'm not sure if we can answer them all, but we'll try. So we have one from Inga. Hi, Ian. I'm curious to know more about case study 2. That's the one about difficult relationship.
Yeah.
Who brought you into that team, and how did the leader respond to your involvement?
Right. So I became aware of the situation because I was facilitating I was acting as a facilitator between this individual and the group in question. Excuse me. So I could see it happening to begin with, and I was part of a group of people who were responsible for putting these meetings together. And so I was able to sort of check my understanding. I mean, your gut feel is a pretty good guide generally. But I recognised that I wasn't the only one who felt like this. And I fairly quickly became aware as well that the individual in question, recognised it as well. They weren't getting satisfaction out of the process either. So the question then became, who spoke to this person? I don't think I was the first person to speak to them. And in the end, I kind of took it. I think I took it on my own back. I think I may have referred it to one or two other people that I was working with. But I kind of took it on my own back, and I got in contact with the individual, and just via email to start with, and said, I think we both recognise that this isn't working as we would want it to. They came back, yes. Do you want to have a meeting about it? And they did. They jumped at the chance. And the irony was, we put some time in the diary. It got cancelled out because of this individual's commitments. We rescheduled it. They cancelled out again. I thought, they're trying to avoid me. Do they really want to face into this? Third time we put the time in the diary was actually the week of an incredibly important event in this individual's life, work-wise. And got to the start of that week, and I said, do you still want to meet this week of all weeks? And they went, yes, I do. So I knew that actually they were committed to it. So we just sat down, and I asked them how they felt about the situation. They expressed their dissatisfaction. I'm being general here because I don't want to reveal identities. But they expressed their dissatisfaction, and I said, well, the dissatisfaction exists equally with the group of people that you're talking to, and they weren't surprised by that. I explained, as I alluded to in the presentation, the reason why. The material that they were presenting was dense, it was jargon heavy. It almost felt like there was a bit of superiority going on, that you were trying to blind people with your knowledge of a very specialist subject with a group of people who were far less knowledgeable. So they felt immediately on the back foot. So how did we open up the subject? How did we make it accessible? How did we make it feel like they could contribute? And I've got to give the individual credit. They were really open to the process. I didn't have to fight them in any way. It was just about then, having the conversation and devising solutions. So, they tried to make the material far more accessible going forward. They were much more open to question and challenge than they had been. Equally, I tried to get the group to be maybe a little bit more forgiving as well, because they got into this place where they weren't prepared to be forgiving on occasions. But it was so I was aware of it because I was in this situation from the outset as a facilitator. And I felt that I had sufficient rapport. Again, rapport is a word that you'll hear facilitators use a lot. I think I had sufficient rapport to have the confidence of approaching the individual who was more senior than me, and saying, can we sit down and do you think a chat would be beneficial? So I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure it did. Thank you so much, Ian. And just for the audience, secretly, without Ian's knowledge, Ian's my secret mentor on facilitation, because everything he says about facilitation, I have to write down because they are so helpful. So we have two more questions which we will try to answer for the next few minutes. So for the audience, please do excuse us for rather brief answers just to fit on the time. So we have another one from Inge. What advice can you give to facilitators to ensure that no agenda meetings don't run away with themselves?
So I think that's a really good question. They will be limited by time, so you need to sort of put a time limit around it. And whilst it's I outlined two types of no agenda meeting. One which is just simply checking in. You might call it checking in meeting. I think that's particularly important when we're doing pretty much all of our work online. So I think there needs to be absolutely no outcome to that, other than people perhaps just mentally making note, particularly line managers who might have line reports in the room with them or online with them, just making a mental note of what they hear and what they may need to hold in their minds going forward. But when you're just talking about a little bit about what you're working on, so you're sharing knowledge with your colleagues, or a little bit about what you've been up to at the weekend, I think you set the time up for the meeting, and you then sign off at the end of that meeting, half an hour, however long it is. When you're doing the other type of meeting where we sort of talked about a form of ideation, it used to be called brainstorming, but isn't really anymore. Then you need to have a little bit of structure in place. It might be that you sort of come in and say, look, the only sense of an agenda you have is that what we're going to talk about today, very loosely, is we're at A and we want to get to B, and we know how the B is where we want to get to, but we've got no idea what the journey looks like. Is it a straight line? Is it a wiggly road? What is it? And that's the only framework that you give to it, and then you allow people to explore how you move from A to B. And somebody, as I sort of said in the presentation, somebody may start off with a good idea and somebody may build on it, so it strengthens and you build on it and you build on it. Or somebody may stress test it and then you think, no, that doesn't work, and so you go back and you try something else. But the only structure, as I say, Inga, that you place on it is that, this is where we are at the moment, this is where we get to, and by the end of this meeting, we want to have some idea of how we get there. And if we haven't got there, we've acknowledged that and we agree what we're going to do in terms of putting more time in the diary to do it. But what you don't then do is put, a 6-step agenda in place, which maybe talks about finances, maybe talks about project management in terms of timescales. All you concentrate very loosely on is the concept and how you're going to get from one place to the other, and then all of the other detail comes later. The idea, as I was saying in the presentation, is that you encourage the idea of participation and collaboration, and that these meetings serve as an example of other meetings that you have, which will be more structured, but still place an emphasis on collaborating and participation. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you, Ian. And if you don't terribly mind, can we just answer one more question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have one quick question from Diane. How might an employee or mouse, to extend the metaphor, try to introduce the concept of psychological safety to senior management? What's its USP?
Get the senior management to watch Amy Edmondson's TED Talk. That would be one thing, or get them to watch this. Seriously, how would I get them to? How would I? Well, I do think some of the stuff that's out there is incredibly powerful, and I think Amy Edmondson's video is really good. It's what got me to realise that what I'd been practicing in John Lewis was psychological safety. I just didn't recognise the concept of it. About trying to create an environment. But I think, I think there's some logic involved in this. I mean, my mind, although I've talked a lot about emotion, I suppose, and people's emotions and feelings in meetings, I tend to think my mind works in a very linear way. For anybody who's ever done something called Myers-Briggs behavioural analysis, I'm an ISTJ, and so if you know what the Myers-Briggs types are, you'll know that that's somebody who thinks very logically, who values facts, who likes to sort of reflect quietly, and then moves to a conclusion. So with that side of me, I think a conversation with a senior leader where you talk to them and say, what would you rather be in? A meeting where people are quiet and fall into line, or where people are open and constructive and participative? Which do you think you get the more out of? And test that on them. I'd be staggered if the leader didn't say the latter, obviously, and then talk to them about the number of occasions where that does happen in their organisation and the number of times that it doesn't, maybe. So if you're trying to engage the leader directly, I do think there is, for me, there's an undeniable logic about this, as well as a sort of a more emotional connection to the subject. But if you don't feel that you can make that connection with the leader, point them in the direction of Amy Edmondson, because I think both the stuff that she's written and the TED Talk, which is incidentally, I think is only about 12 minutes long, is a terrific introduction to the concept.
Fabulous. And thank you so much, Ian, for answering these interesting questions. We have some lovely comments came through in the chat from Ian. Not from Ian, Leanne.
That'd be awful if I was commenting and bigging myself up, wouldn't it?
It's from Leanne. I'm so sorry. It's my just Korean tongue making mistake. I have had the pleasure of working with Ian. Oh, very lucky you. And he's one of the best facilitators, ensuring everyone is included, has an opportunity to contribute, and that their views are respected. And this has been detailed by Natasha. And also a lovely comment from Diane, stimulating. The time went too quickly. I agree. Thanks very much, Ian. And another one from Margarita. Thank you very much. Very informative and a lot of practical takeaways. And also, thank you from Inga. So thanks so much for the audience tonight, and our wonderful Ian, the facilitation expert. Just to let you know that Ian now has his own consultancy called Ian Hiscock Consultancy. You can see the lovely logo at the bottom left of the screen. So that's Ian's consultancy. And the website hasn't yet been ready, but it will be up and running. So if any of you watching this tonight and later on YouTube has any facilitation sort of inquiries for training, workshop facilitation, etc., please email directly Ian and visit his website once it's ready. I'll share his contact details later on. So thank you so much, Ian, for your time and the talk today. And thank you so much for everyone tuning in tonight. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Yun-Jong. And Yun-Jong, thanks ever so much for the opportunity. And on behalf, I guess, is this the last session?
No, we have 2 more sessions.
Right. Well, on behalf of all the speakers who have spoken so far, thank you for giving us the opportunity to do this with you.
Pleasure, Ian. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tonight. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.